So I'm John Harris, and today I think the terms are player manager, because I'm supposed to chair and facilitate the panel, but chip in as well. So remind me, if I start talking too much, I'll have forgotten I'm the facilitator. I'll be waiting for someone to stop me, so give me a nudge. I'm just going to introduce the panel briefly, and then we're going to kick off by each saying just a couple of minutes about our sort of hopes and fears for the cloud, for infrastructure as a service, for platform as a service. So it's a very learned panel that we've got today. On my left, I've got Alan Lee-Bourke of the Wise Group, and then Dave Foster of CERN, and then Dan Sims from Browne Jacobson, and finally Maurice Martin from Microsoft. So, Alan, I'm going to pick on you first. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your organisation and what you're seeing with the cloud. What is it that you're positive about, and what are the things where you're saying, hang on, we've got to watch that?
Cool, yeah. Alan Lee-Bourke, the Wise Group's a not-for-profit. We've got 600 people, and we help people get jobs and help communities grow and get better. So it's a social goal. We don't have shareholders, we make profit, and it just goes straight back into the company. And we compete in the open market against global players. We've won some very large contracts in that. And one of the main reasons is that we've been able to expand in capacity, IT capacity, almost instantly with the cloud. I think we were the first Microsoft user in Europe to go live with BPOS. We've been beta testing Office 365 in the cloud since last October, since the San Francisco launch. And it only hit me in the train today, which was half an hour late. That's why I'm sitting here sweating. But I was logged into Link, which we have hosted, using one bar of a SIM card on my laptop. That's all I had as a signal. I had a video conference call with 3 folk in the office. In the middle of that, my Office extension rang on my laptop. I answered that, paused the call, went back to the call, made some notes in my cloud version of OneNote, shut it down and had a sleep. So I knew it all intellectually, but when I did that today, I thought, wow, that's pretty impressive. And no infrastructure, or very little infrastructure. It's gradually all getting binned back in the office to support all of that. So for me, the I in my title is critical. It means information. I also sit in the leadership team so that nobody cares about computing in the leadership team of my company. All they want is good information to make business decisions. And if I'm mucking about with wires and spanners, I'm not doing that. So cloud for me lets me focus on the information bit and not the wires and spanners bit.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alan. Dave.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. So my name's David Foster. I'm from CERN. So we are, as probably most of you know, the big particle physics research lab in Geneva, Switzerland. So we run a very large facility, of course, which is the accelerator itself. And this is to provide data for the physics community around the world. So we've got a very big computing infrastructure physically located at CERN, but we also have collaborating institutes literally around the world. There are 11 very large data centers that form part of what we call the LHC computing grid. So we've been very used already to tying together, if you like, computing facilities in remote locations in a distributed way into what would be viewed by the user as one integrated facility. So it's a sort of distributed private cloud interconnected, and that's really what the grid computing paradigm is these days when you look at tying together these very big infrastructures. So we've been doing that for several years now. But within the IT context of CERN, the laboratory itself, we've been looking at cloud services. So we've been using a platform as a service now, which is a company that makes a platform for service management. So we decided to get into the business by looking at what it would mean to take our ticketing system and our service management process infrastructure and run that from an infrastructure such as ServiceNow. So we've been doing that on the one hand, so that's really a software as a service, platform as a service play. And we're also looking now at creating an extension to the CERN data center that would be not another building on the CERN site, but would actually be a infrastructure as a service somewhere else, somewhere where electricity is cheaper, where it's greener, where we can actually start to push the idea that if you're doing large science and you're doing large science infrastructures, you don't actually have to have the computing co-located with the science anymore. You can actually put the computing facilities where it's greener and where the overall costs are cheaper. Of course, for that, you've got to start and look at all the operational models. So this is forcing us to go back now and look at all of our operations and say, okay, this is how we run our data center today on the CERN site, when you can walk in to the data center and the machines. But what if that data center is no longer there, but is somewhere, at some remote country? You're not going to have the luxury of being able to operate the same way. So changing the operational processes is an important part of that in this infrastructure as a service play. So we're looking at, we're experimenting with the platform as a service, software as a service, trying to understand all the associated risks with that, trying to understand what works well, what doesn't, trying to understand the contracts, actually, and the SLAs. So I'm pretty interested in what comes after this panel session. And on the other side, looking at the infrastructure as a service, which brings in to question all that we do in terms of operations, virtualization, how we run the services, what services we run. So it's a real combination of things that we're doing today. But we're very excited about being able to bring in the green aspect, the environmental aspect, together with the sort of cost effectiveness part of that.
Great, thank you, Dave. Dan, give us a view from the legal industry.
Hi, I'm Dan Sims, IT and Business Operations Director at Browne Jacobson LLP. We have about 550 people based in Midlands and in London, so offices in Nottingham and Birmingham. For us, the cloud is interesting, both in terms of opportunities that it offers us and also our clients, because I think I wear several hats in that obviously we buy services that are cloud-based. We equally provide services that are cloud-based to our clients as well. You might think, well, that's quite unusual for solicitors to do that, but actually we've been doing it for many years in the form of document extranets and more recently, actually, more complex products like, for instance, we have a cloud-based counter-fraud product. I think from my perspective, what excites me about the cloud is that it allows us to move and to take advantage of opportunities in a much faster way. We want to do time recording. Actually, we can go and buy a product. We don't have to necessarily spend too much time thinking about it. We can test the product quite quickly. Does it fit the bill? Yes, it does. Put it in. I think in days gone by, because of the expense around capital purchases and things, we would have spent a lot more time, for instance, going through competitive tender and things like that. Whereas actually with the cloud, we can buy a product quite quickly. We can perform due diligence quite quickly based on the information that we're going to put into this platform and be up and running quite quickly. And I think that's what excites me about it. What I think concerns me about it is some of the obvious things like lack of standards, inability to compare different types of service easily, inability to really perform due diligence easily. So some of the big cloud-based providers actually don't let you get into their data centers and look at the way that they're providing those services, and to look at their processes and to look at the types of people that they're employing. It's down to a contractual document, which obviously, as a law firm, we spend a lot of time looking at those and advising our clients in that area. But at the end of the day, there's an element of trust here, and I think that's something that concerns us and has probably made the adoption of the cloud in the legal sector less fast-paced compared to some of the other sectors. I think we also, in the legal sector, have quite a lot of integration between things like case management systems, our finance system. The IT actually is actually reasonably complex and quite integrated, and actually unpicking elements of that, moving it into the cloud, becomes actually quite complex too. So I'll give you a quick example. I'm very keen on the idea of moving to a hosted cloud-based email platform, something like BPOS or Office 365. I think there's a lot of attractions there in terms of its flexibility, but when you start getting under the skin of it, you then realise that some of the applications you've got on your BlackBerry might not necessarily work as they've done previously, and there are lots of little things like that that sort of get in the way of you doing that adoption. So I think, whilst the cloud does seem to offer lots and lots of advantages, there are lots of things when you get under the skin of it, actually you start to find reasons why maybe you wouldn't be, for certain things like email, adopting it quite as quickly. Okay.
That's a great segue, I think, for Maurice from Microsoft to come and give us your...
Yeah. Hi there, everyone. My name's Maurice Martin. I lead that part of Microsoft that brings both Hyper-V Cloud, infrastructure as a service, and Azure, our public cloud offering, to market. And I've got some opportunity later on to talk about some of that more detail. So I'll just give two little vignettes. I've just come back from a week in the southwest of France with my kids. And the first little vignette, which I think goes to show, actually, from a cloud computing where we're at, I was talking to my two daughters, one's 14 and one's 12. And for them, 2 or 3 years ago, they used to use a thing called Hotmail, and they used to use a thing called MSN Messenger. Okay? And now they kind of look at me and say, what are they, Dad? I don't know what they are anymore, because everything's just done on Facebook. And they bumped into a bunch of girls in the kids' club, and right back, the night we got back, they just sent a little message back to, she was able to find this girl, just from knowing her first and surname, and approximately in England, and has now connected her into her social network. But the idea that from an email or even instant messaging, which for some folks in the room still might be new technology, that's just gone. That's just completely gone at this point from their psyche. I think this is really interesting. So the point I'm making really is, I think when you have really big scale cloud platforms, there really are new kinds of things going to come our way that we don't know about yet. And I think once we see the adoption of this technology into folks that are providing this, I think we're going to see a really different kind of ecosystem happening. And I don't think any of us really know what that's going to be yet. And that would be the first one. The second one then, too, is this concept of ease of use. And there's this phrase, it just works. And I really like the concept that it must just work. And I think fundamentally there's a real user driver to that. I was having a chat earlier with Dave, and we were saying, well, we thought people would get more techie as we moved into all the use of this technology. But in actual fact, we're becoming less techie. And it's about actually using the technology, and it should just work. And we're at a point now where if it doesn't, we just use something else or we don't do it. So one of the examples was I was able to do a little video of my son on a bike ride on the Ridgeway there a couple of weeks ago. I pushed a button, and it went to Facebook. This was a video and pictures. And by the time I came home, some friends had commented on back in Ireland to say, wow, that's great. Looks like you're really settling in. Now, truly, if I had tried to do that 2 years ago, it would have been, downloading cables, drivers. It would have been very, very, very hard. So again, the principle of connected devices in the real world, back to what we're doing and back to these kind of services we can now offer on cloud platforms, I think it's going to be really interesting. And I know that's a more consumer angle because I get to talk the business stuff later, but I think it's going to be really interesting to see where we go.
That's great. Thank you, Maurice. So just putting my panelist hat on instead of facilitator for a minute. Just a couple of perspectives. From a GlaxoSmithKline perspective, we've used the cloud in a number of different areas, but BPaaS has been our biggest foray. So I don't think we were the first, but I think you guys were obviously the first. I think we were the first big player that moved. We're sort of 100,000 or so seats. It isn't easy to move. You shouldn't get into the perspective of cloud is easier, because all of the kind of issues that Dan referred to and Dave referred to, you've still got to go through and figure out. But when you get there, there's some real benefits. For us, there's a certain amount of flex in a global company. You might have a sales force expanding in one country and retracting in another. Well, in the old licensing world, whilst in theory you could transfer licenses, you get into inter-country laws and policies and the rest of it. Now it's simple. We pay for what we use, and we really have that flexibility. And I think that's the main thing that excites me about the usability of cloud. It is that flex. There's another story that I'll share from I chair a group called the Corporate IT Forum, which some of you may know as, it used to be known as TIFF. So we've got a number of members from public and private sector. And there was a great story one of our members from a confectionery company told about how they'd really got some value out of infrastructure as a service. And they had a situation where the marketing department had put together a promotion for free chocolate. And it was free chocolate on a Friday morning if you logged onto the website at 9 o'clock. And this was a big deal. They were advertising it in the Super Bowl, and you can imagine the money going into it. And, of course, like any good marketeer, they didn't tell IT that they'd done this. I think they might have given them a couple of hours' notice and said, by the way, make sure the website's up tomorrow. Anyway, this guy who was responsible for the website came and talked to us. He said it lasted 10 minutes. And he said, we looked at the traffic profile. This was one of the biggest promotions we'd ever seen in the States. And he said, I worked out if I took everything down in my data center and put it all to supporting this web platform, I'd still only have half the capacity I needed. Anyway, marketing, they've spent their money. It's been in the Super Bowl. They've got a week to fix it. And what he was able to do was something that a few years ago, that was an absolutely insoluble problem. That was just an embarrassing, we've made a big mistake. But what they were able to do in the space of a week, using, I think they used a couple of supporting companies as well, but effectively they used the Amazon cloud, and this guy actually paid with his credit card, and the traffic burst onto the Amazon cloud for probably only about half an hour, 40 minutes through the hectic free chocolate period on a Friday, and that resolved their issue. So when you hear stories like that, you suddenly realise that there is just a different way of working and a different opportunity. The other thing which it'll be interesting to get some views on is I have a real hope that the pay-as-you-go flexibility model that you pay for the value that you get really starts to change the industry. And again, this is wearing my corporate IT forum hat. Every company that I talk to, every member is less than enamoured with the idea that we pay for 100,000 licenses up front, pay maintenance on them, and then it's up to us to get the value from them. So when you buy in the cloud, you don't do that. Surely that's going to have a knock-on effect and change the way that we actually run business across the cloud overall. So those are sort of my big hopes. Fears, I think data, and I guess we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. But data, where is your data? Who's actually got it? How can you manage it? How do you integrate it? That's still, a tough issue. So look, I'm going to check now whether there are any questions initially from the floor. Any starters for 10? Stuart. And we do want to make this interactive. We can probably, as you've seen, all talk for days if we're allowed to, but it might be good that you focus us a little bit.
I've heard a few people talking recently about desktop as a service, and that's been something that's coming in more and more. Is that something which the people on the panel, are your businesses consuming that service or looking to consume it, or what are your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, that's one that I've heard in the last week or two, and it's one that we're watching very closely. I think, there's something attractive about that where in the traditional model, if you have applications that are not used often or perhaps only used by a third party, the traditional way of working is that you're provisioning infrastructure and it's a sunk cost. So, if that model really came to fruition, I could see a lot of advantages and, again, some flexibility there. I don't know, is this something that you guys have thought about at all?
Yeah, maybe I can say a few words. Yeah, we've always had a managed desktop ever since the days of Windows 3.1. I can honestly say. But I think the big question becomes, what skills do you need in an enterprise IT department? And when the technology becomes commodity, is that the time to actually, drop those skills and move it out to a service provider? So, I mean, it's always the classic problem is you want to retain the skills that are of core value to the business, but where do you draw the line? We don't produce our own electricity, right? We just buy it. It's a commodity. So at what point do you say, okay, this technology is now a commodity, now we don't need the in-house skills for this. We can safely move that out. So I think that's a core decision, right? And I think people are still struggling with that. I mean, we are not yet comfortable with moving email out. But there's no real reason why we're not comfortable right now. Of course, we have the skills, so we can still continue to do it. But there will come a point in the not-too-distant future when staff rotate, you want to get new people. So do you get new people who have Microsoft Exchange skills? Or do you say, no, that's the time, we'll use an Exchange service that's in the cloud somewhere? This, of course, is without all of the issues about the data. And this assumes that somehow you're comfortable with where your data are and who has access to it, and all the legal bindings that go around all of that. But assuming that from a technological standpoint, I think the decision is when it's commodity, then you don't need the skills, and that's the time you sort of move it out.
Yeah, no, I think the whole principle of VDI, or offering desktop as a service, is one that goes in and out of fashion and has done so every 6 months in and out for the last 2 or 3 years. And I think the initial drive here was to say, hey, it is just so darn expensive to manage those, maybe those apps or those PCs that weren't being used frequently enough. So there was this concept from a cost-driving point of view to say, hey, let's go virtualize those. But 2 key points. It's actually more expensive from a server data center point of view, typically, to roll up a first-class VDI implementation. So, certainly in the UK, when we look at organizations that have done it, they haven't actually done it from a cost savings point of view. They've actually, going back to the point you're making about data, one of them was one of the large police forces. They actually wanted to be able to have multiple systems in an absolutely secure way, so that independent of the actual endpoint device you used, be it a phone or an iPad or a laptop or whatever it was, that you would absolutely guarantee there was no history on those endpoint devices, and they could be completely controlled. So it's interesting that's where we actually see the desktop as a service having a business value. It's not really a low-cost play anymore.
So, I agree, Maurice, but the interesting thing is traditionally we've sort of thought that the desktop will always need to be there. But actually, if you really get to the point where you're using cloud apps all the time, maybe there's a model where you use your iPad to access the cloud on most of your business day, and then occasionally you go to a cloud desktop where you're paying as you go rather than having it in your own data center. And I think that's the interesting switch on desktop in the cloud. You actually, if you only use that desktop and that app for 3 hours a week, that's what you pay for. And it's that flex that's great. We've got a question in the audience.
Hi.
If you could just tell us who you are and where you're from, that'd be great as well. Thank you.
Hi, Angela Jacobson from Horizon Nuclear Power. We're a joint venture between E.ON and RWE. I'm in the lucky position where we're totally greenfield. We don't have to go back to parent. So we've just implemented, in the rollout now, so your input is vital at this present moment in time about SLAs and contracts. But we have gone totally outsourced. So my IT team now is governance body. But we've gone desktop, we've gone virtualization on servers, and we're doing it totally from a greenfield site. So going green, obviously, being in the nuclear business was very important to us. And as you rightly say, cost hasn't really been the be-all and end-all of the route we've gone to. We've wanted, because we've got that flexibility, to go new, to go taking even BPOS further. We're working with Microsoft on a weekly basis practically to take that to the next level. So really, really interested on, how we then monitor all of this, because we're going through one company as a single point of contact, but to manage all of our other suppliers. So really interested to, once you've gone this virtualised route, in the nuclear industry, we've got to keep our data in the UK. We can't just push BPOS in. We've got to have 4 extra levels of security on BPOS, so we've gone tighter slabs and the use of all of that stuff. So really interested from the panel, when you have gone that virtualisation, how do you manage that third-party relationship from a contractual position and an SLA position? Because it is difficult.
Alan, why don't you kick us off on that? Because you've done a lot of this in an organisation where I guess you've got a lot of sensitivities and data issues to manage. So how do you tackle this governance issue that Angela describes?
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways the reason Microsoft and others can offer cloud is because they commoditize it, and everybody's got to take the same thing, so you can't really negotiate, except if you're a big company, you can, of course.
Within reason.
Within reason. You can ask him about that. We're only 600 people. So you take what's given to you. But you're right about... I suppose there's two things that strike me. One is managing, it's almost... I can almost accept that there will be some outages, even no matter what the SLA says, because when I use things like BPOS and I use things like Dynamics CRM, in the cloud, they have local caches that store locally. So even if you lose the connection, you can still work till it resyncs. So you almost, 99.9% for me isn't as critical as to the guy who I met a few weeks ago who runs Sony and has 40 million concurrent users on gaming. And when he told me that, I thought, bloody hell, it's just incredible. And you know what gamers are like. I'm not a gamer, but he tells me if you're out for half an hour, you're dead. So that's a different paradigm. But also data, absolutely. We have government contracts, and the British government doesn't let us store personal information outside the UK, not even Dublin, even though the Queen visited recently. But I think there's a big move on to try and change that, because the law is that the data protection is within the European Economic Area. There's other guys that are pan-European that can probably address that better than me. So ultimately, I just accept that there will be outages, the same way as I accept that I'll have electricity outages, I don't know many people that have got backup power generators. You probably have. My wife has. She works in an operating theatre. Many businesses and homes have it, none. So you accept it and you mitigate it.
Any other questions come forward? Please.
Phil Lockman, CA Technologies. I've got a quick question for we just heard it. Oh, can you hear me all right now?
I can now.
Sorry, Phil Lockman, CA Technologies. Sorry about that. I was just obviously eager to get the question in. So I've got a quick question for Dan, which actually builds on something that I believe it was Alan just said there. In terms of data, and in the context of cloud, in your opinion, how much of that is going to be driven by a change in legislation, or is it just basically increasing confidence?
Well, I think a complex subject, and I think it basically falls this issue of where the data is actually housed. I think if it falls within the EU, then of course you're subject to one set of rules. Obviously, if it falls in the US, you've got Safe Harbour that provides some protection, but you've got the Patriot Act that potentially puts you at risk. But then actually, in this country, we've got anti-terrorism laws that potentially would allow access to data anyway in certain circumstances. So I think from my perspective, it's not just about that element of it. I think there's also the way that people manage your data as well. I think the fact, I'll give you an example, not this particular law firm, but another law firm, we were operating a very big litigation case. I won't go into the details, but it was huge litigation case, and we employed a third party to operate an e-disclosure system for us. And as part of the selection process for that particular system, we sent somebody to literally go and check the data center security where the system was hosted, and we also checked their premises and made sure they had appropriate security in place and things like that. And we could do that because that particular provider was happy for us to do that. They were a small enough provider to allow us that flexibility. But if you're talking about the likes of Google, actually, you're never going to get into their data centers.
It's interesting though when you look at it that way. So you could go into a smaller company and check the data and see where it is. But if you actually think about the chances of something bad happening to a smaller company, it's probably much greater. So you could argue that the data risk profile is greater. So there is this sort of balance between what you legally need to do for compliance reasons, and then also sort of managing your risk. And one of the challenges of the cloud, of course, is you can do business with Fred, who's actually buying, Fred sells you software as a service, and he's buying it off Julie, who runs platform as a service, and then actually the data is run in the infrastructure layer by someone else again. I think I don't have all the answers to it, but I do think it's really, really important that as well as knowing that you meet the legal compliance issues, you actually know who the companies are that are in your stack and who are in that service chain.
And due diligence, absolutely, but that's got to be linked with the type of service again. I think when it comes to something that, I don't know, a project management tool that you're not going to put any confidential information in it, then that's one set of due diligence. If you're talking about moving a core system, your CRM system or email system, that's another set of due diligence. So,
Sure.
Hi, I'm Abigail.
Sorry, Abigail.
Right.
Okay.
I'm Abigail from computing. Do you think that the sort of the killer app, as it were, for the cloud is going to be from the people or from the technology? What's really going to drive it? Is it going to be business need or is it going to be people in IT?
Who'd like to take that? We should all have a go at that. With just a few seconds with Maurice.
Yeah, so if I look at the amount of productive hours my wife spends on Angry Birds, you could argue, is that the, I think what we're going to see is, I think we're going to see a convergence. So I think we talked earlier about the concept of the desktop. Well, the reality is I don't really have a desktop anymore. Okay, so I get assigned a cube when I go in, I get to work in it, I come away again. So the principle I think I think the killer app will be the fact that you'll be able to get what you want, where you want, when you want, and how you want, rather than I think any specific any specific new app. I think there's going to be a ton of specific new apps as well. But actually, I think the principle of genuinely just reducing the friction and enabling literally new ways to work, I think is the killer app. I was with a bunch of, I'd say, the top 30 sort of practice leads for the main SIs in the UK recently, and we were at dinner afterwards, and I almost fell off my chair when, I don't know if I should say this or not now, but anyway, when 50% of those organisations don't permit Facebook or Twitter access or even broad internet access in their organisations. And I was genuinely, I was shocked by that. Okay, so I think, so my sense anyway would be, I think the killer app is going to be pervasive access to what you want to get to. So the desktop's dead, you get to what you want to get to.
Dan, give us your 10 seconds.
I tend to agree. I think the consumer's most definitely driving the cloud. And I think once we get cloud-based desktops in consumer space, for instance, and that's coming, then how many times have you heard when a customer of yours comes up to you or one of your users saying, actually, I've got this at home, I want it in the office? And I think, well, whether like it or not, I think it's upon us, and we'll have to deal with it.
A consumerised Hadron Collider?
Yeah, I think that would be good. Actually, it would solve our funding problem. But I think I tend to agree with my fellow panelists here, in the sense that. So let me say something a bit more controversial. I think we have failed in the computing industry to make computing totally obvious. We've failed so far, and totally manageable, which is perhaps more to the point. So, I don't know how people at home manage their home PCs. I consider myself somewhat of an expert in computing, and I spend so much time fixing stuff, right? Be it, Windows or Macintosh, because I have, or Linux for that matter, so I have them all at home. So, I think one of the promises of that type of commodity cloud is that you take all of that problem away from the end user. And the thing that makes it possible is the move in the last 10 years towards very cheap high-performance networking for everybody. And I think that that's what brings the whole possibility that actually you can have a simple device. So this is back now to where we were. I think I first heard about this in about 1990, the thin client. So you have this very simple device that doesn't require any maintenance at home, and yet you can interact with it and all the applications as though they were running on some sort of local machine, right? And I think once we get there, then you're no longer worried about backups. You're no longer worried about viruses. You're no longer, and then you have all of this new era of business models for micro-billing and for billing applications. So you want to try an application out, maybe you can just pay as you go. You like it, so you want to keep it for the next year, so you pay for the year or for the month, or or in some usage model. So I think it can hide an awful lot of issues and make computing very accessible in a managed and maintained way, and remove all of the doubt and problems that people have, I think, using home devices today. So the iPad, I think, is successful because it's essentially a zero maintenance device. It's getting towards that point, but it doesn't do everything you want it to do. So maybe those other type of applications you want, they come from the cloud in a sort of software as a service model. So I think there's a very interesting transition going on right now that enables us to really get past where we were with home computing and home hardware that's difficult to manage and maintain, and is a little bit sort of flaky around the edges and doesn't quite work, and you're not quite sure what's happening, and maybe you're infected with a virus, and did you back up the disk, and all this. We can get past all of that into some new future.
Right. Alan?
I think it's consumers, and it's pre-teen and teen consumers, like my son and daughter, who are 13 and 11 respectively. They don't give a stuff about hardware, they just consume stuff. And I suppose if we've all got sons or daughters of that age, they're all miles ahead of us. One example, in my organisation, I've got the devil's own job, encouraging people to create a My page in SharePoint. Why would I want to do that? My son, on the other hand, and I suspect all your sons and daughters, knows enough now even to have a Facebook page, which is a real one, and another one that says he polishes wheelchairs and attends church every Sunday, so that when he's asked for that in his UCA form, he can give him the other one. Now, you think I'm joking, but I'm not. Now, that's how sophisticated they are, and I suspect we've all got stories like that, and that's what's driving it. It's not old gimmers like me.
No, that's great. I mean, I think it absolutely is around the consumer. I don't think I have a lot to add other than it may come from a space that we don't expect. So I think, Dave, you were still talking about computers in sort of computing terms, Macs and PCs and the rest of it. Yeah. But I think it's very interesting to watch the teens and the pre-teens and the games machines. You look at the breakthrough the Wii was. If anyone, well, it's kids at home and things, but if you look at the Microsoft Xbox Kinect, suddenly you've got a way of interacting with a computer where there is no keyboard, there's no mouse, it's just you as a person. So I'm not bright enough to unlock all of the opportunities that I'm sure are there using that technology. If there was, I wouldn't be messing around. I'd be sitting on, an island in the Caribbean somewhere. But undoubtedly, there will be new ways of interacting with technology that we just don't think of. And actually, to your point that you said, Maurice, I did hear a great story the other day that in your iPhone, there is now more computing than NASA had when they put a man on the moon. And the most common use for it, throwing birds at pigs. Which, you never know where it's coming from.
My name's Rob Gibson. I'm from SQA up in sunny Scotland. I'd like to go back to the beginning part of the story that we haven't really covered much. You've talked about, I guess we're all sort of largely technologists in the room. The problem we have is I've got 700 fixed staff and I've got 15,000 temporary staff, none of whom are teenagers, none of whom come to work to play games. None of them have to play games. If they don't want to know about the technology and how they receive their stuff and how they get to their applications, which I don't need them to understand, how do I build a business case? How do I start? They don't want to be interested in any of this. They think IT costs a huge amount as it is. So I've got to try and talk to the rest of my executive team, particularly the finance director, and say, look, I need umpteen £1 million to transfer what I'm doing now and hand it to somebody else, and actually, all the risk that goes with it. And they will take some convincing right at the beginning. So you're already into the journey by the sounds of it in many different respects. But right back at the beginning, that's got to be a really difficult question to start. For a business that hasn't started considering how to move into the cloud. I know there are benefits out there, but I've got to turn that into a model that says, yeah, let me go spend an awful lot of money to try this because it's going to be better in the long run.
So, Alan, I'll get you to comment in a minute. I can give you a catalyst for GSK moving to BPaaS. We had got to a point where our existing in-house, we were mainly a note shop, and we'd got to a point where we had to do something. It was time for a refresh, so an investment was necessary. That was the first thing. So there wasn't a case of convincing, the board and the holders of budgets and so on that do nothing was an option. So we needed to make a move. And I think that's probably, for all of these commoditized services, that's usually going to be a factor. There's some trigger point that means that you need to make a move. Once you get there, then it's interesting to weigh up the traditional ways of doing things. So you have a level of control, investment models you understand where you're owning your own technology, you can write it off, you control the full life cycle, versus the flexibility of a workforce or, in your case, I guess it's a series of partners and so on, that may well flex up and down. And there's a sort of certain financial model that is really quite attractive there. So that was a big part of the decision for us. We weren't quite sure where our business was going to go, over the lifespan of a mail system. There'd be certain countries we'd expand, certain where we'd decrease, and helping manage that flex was a big part of it. So I think from a business case perspective, it's getting into those discussions around the traditional numbers, what they would look like, how you traditionally locked in, how much can you predict. If you know exactly what's happening for the next 10 years, maybe a cloud model's less attractive. But if you really think that you're in a state of flux and unpredictability, then the cloud and some of the flex really comes into its own. Alan, what was your story?
Oh, yeah, much the same, except 100 times smaller. But it's the finance director loved the fact that it wasn't capital anymore; it was operational expenditure, or capex and opex, as Microsoft call it, which is great. But I had various, trigger points that I used. For example, to provision a new office, it cost me about £25,000 for a PBX telephony exchange per office for about 20 or 25 people. Now it's £2.60 a user a month. That's an easy sum. So I just picked all of those individual items and showed how that could work. In the headquarters, it was about £80,000 to replace the IT systems, and I replaced it for £2.60. Sorry, the telephony, £2.60 a user a month with Link. And ultimately, we've moved to this concept called Instant On. And this is not to start the project as you are, but it's where I am now with Link, Office 365 and all these things. Basically, a new office to me is just a little laptop with all that on it and a broadband connection. So we provisioned somebody in Shetland last week, a laptop, £500, £2.60 a user a month, post it off, and that's them got an office. So that was, especially for temporary or remote staff, that was incredibly easy, rather than configuring a computer, telephony, all that stuff. So it was all those little things that gave a real robust financial case.
And do you think you were cheaper in the end, or is it the flex that was the benefit, or did you get both?
We did. For Microsoft forced us to think about it and do. We really needed to change, so we just did it. But Microsoft forced us to put numbers on it for all the case studies that we do, and it was £300,000 a year for a 600-person organisation that we save now.
And Dave, you're fairly heavily into the cloud as well.
Yeah, I think from the cost standpoint, it's really very tricky. I think some of the things avoiding sort of capex investments. Definitely, if we look at moving to the new data center we want to put, if we do that as an infrastructure as a service, which we're almost certain to do, because we've already done some investigation into what it would cost. it has an attractive element, is that there will not be the huge capital outlay of building a data center of our own. However, on a long time scale, it's more expensive, of course, because you're not amortizing the same cost. It's costing you something. And I think it's the same is true of the other as a services, so software as a service, platform as a service. Not at all obvious if it's cheaper or more expensive. So the rationale has to come, either you can really analyze those numbers, and so you fully understand what your costs would be if you did it yourself, as opposed to doing it outside. Maybe the driver actually comes from somewhere else, and for us, probably from a cost standpoint, in the very long term, not at all obvious. Depends on the scale, of your operations, whether or not you're better having in-house skills or not. But I think for us, one of the drivers was the fact that actually we have a certain number of people we can hire, and they have certain skills. So do we choose them to have this set of skills or a different set of skills? And for us, the interesting thing is to say, yeah, these commodity IT skills, because now a lot of things in IT are becoming commodity very rapidly. Those people we don't need to hire anymore. So we can actually hire people with a different set of skills that is more value adding to the business now. And even if it turns out that the operational costs of moving some of this stuff to the cloud is more expensive, as Maurice alluded to, that's actually okay, because we're optimizing the business as a whole. We're optimizing the skill set as a whole. So somehow you've got to take the costs and then take the business as a whole and look at optimizing the whole set of things, not just one part, because by optimizing one part, you're missing the bigger picture, potentially.
I think just building on that then, I think the point though is you characterized a kind of a binary scenario where you had to throw out everything you've got to move to the cloud. I think one of the big benefits of moving it to the cloud, so if you were going from a traditional on-prem solution A to on-prem solution B, yeah, you'd have to go doing that. I think one of the great things about cloud technology is now you could turn on a department or yourself or 10 people and try it, right, at very, very low financial risk. And I think that's something that has been traditionally notoriously annoyingly hard to do, particularly when you get down to line of business vendors and you want to get a specific science app or a specific drug app together. It's notoriously difficult to really try before you buy. Whereas I think one of the great benefits of cloud computing from a commercials point of view is, as we've talked to, is you can play with it first. And you're not going to be locked in or down some horrendous investment curve before you realize this is not appropriate for my needs, might be the nice way of saying it. So I would encourage you to play, you can play with it without that initial upfront investment.
Just another couple of quick points. Perhaps an obvious point, but it's not an all or nothing. I think when you're considering these things, you can start small and grow it, get your confidence up. Perhaps start in an area where it's not quite as critical to build your confidence that way. And I wouldn't necessarily, just drawing on the point you just made, actually see this as being we've got to go in the cloud because actually somebody's told me that this is the latest and greatest thing. It's just another way of doing the same thing. There may well be for your business a different way of doing the same thing, not involving the cloud. You've ultimately got to try and make that call based on the requirements of the business. So don't just see it as being that this is the way everybody's going. That you've got to do it. I think you've still got to go through those steps in the business case to assess it like it alongside any other solution as you would normally do.
Good. I think that's a great question. How are we doing time-wise? Do we have time for one more, Stuart? One more question? One more question. At the front.
Thank you. David Mappin, Seven Seas. The thing I've liked about this whole thing is something I've been trying to push for a long time. Try before you buy. And that makes common sense to everybody. And that's what you've all been promoting, and I thank you greatly.
I think that's a great place to close, actually, because I think that's exactly what the cloud model gives us. It's a level of flexibility and choice that the traditional industry hasn't really had in place for a long time. So, yeah, I mean, that's really what it's about. It's flex and choice that we didn't have previously.